I want you to do something that might seem a little strange for a second. I want you to imagine being in Paul's position. At this moment in his life, Paul's in prison. He's isolated from those he's closest to, in touch mainly through letter. He was lashed at least 5 times in his life. He would be shipwrecked and bitten by snakes and brought to stand trial in front of officials for hearings charging him for preaching the gospel. I want you to imagine how you might feel in this situation. Maybe you're thinking that you would feel betrayed. You might feel alone. Perhaps you feel like it's just really, really unfair. And I imagine if it was me, I would have some questions for God. These would all be entirely understandable reactions. Paul's position is undeniably difficult. But amazingly, in all this, he never loses joy or hope. Paul writes in verse 12 that his situation is advancing the gospel. In verse 18, he tells us that for this spread of the gospel, he will rejoice. In verse 19, he shows us that he has hope, that he won't be ashamed, but instead he'll be given courage. What I'd like to suggest is that Paul doesn't have what we would call in the 21st century main character energy. If Paul had main character energy, then he would focus on his guards as oppressors. We would see a scene at the end of the second act where Paul would hopelessly attempt to hatch an escape plan, or he'd be feeling sorry for himself in his cell, awaiting the grand realization of how to fix his story. That's not Paul's reaction. Paul instead is focused on God's story. He sees God's purposes. He was convinced that despite the hardship, his situation was advancing the gospel. His focus is on his part in God's story, in which Jesus is the main character. His role in prison isn't to feel sorry for himself. He spreads the gospel to the prison guards as if they're friends of Jesus already. He writes to churches like the one in Philippi, who this letter was to. He furthers God's kingdom because he knows the main character is Jesus and not himself. And that's not to say that he's removed from his reality. It's that he knows the one whose faith is in is the one who writes his destiny. And that's great and all, but you might be thinking, well, Josh, that's Paul, and I'm not a biblical writer. How can I do this? Well, Paul gives us the answer in verse 19 of how he keeps his joy, but continues to have courage to spread the good news. The truth is, just like the story isn't about him, it's also not by his power either. Paul in verse 19 cites two things that help him here: prayer from the community around him and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus within him, who's the main desire in Paul's life. Right now, there are a lot of things that can feel like our prisons. Perhaps your prison's being isolated from friends while still having to learn online. Maybe your prison's been coming back into lockdown with stricter measures than we anticipated. Perhaps it's being away from church physically for most of the year. Maybe it's not a pandemic problem at all. There are a lot of things that can feel like prisons, particularly right now. But if Paul teaches us anything in this passage, it's that when we have our life focused on the Spirit of Jesus, which we all have within us, that we can be sustained in his joy, in his peace, his hope. But further still, Paul teaches that in these circumstances, we can't do it alone. We need to be praying for and supporting one another. We need to rely on others as our church family, receiving love as we give it. Through both these things, we can be given both the courage and the joy to persevere in the present moments in life.